The cold bit into Baron's skin before he even opened his eyes. He stirred, the rough fabric of the park bench pressing into his back. Above him, the sky was a pale gray, the kind that promised rain but hadn't yet delivered. He sat up slowly, his head throbbing, and looked around. Central Park stretched out in all directions, trees, paths, and the distant hum of the city beyond. He didn't know where he was. Worse, he didn't know who he was. His hands trembled as he patted himself down, searching for clues. His clothes were worn but not ragged, a faded jacket, and jeans that hung loosely on his frame. No wallet. No phone. Just a crumpled receipt in his pocket with a coffee stain and a smudged date. A jogger passed by, headphones in, oblivious. Baron opened his mouth to call out, but no sound came. His throat was dry, his voice lost somewhere in the fog of his mind. He stood, unsteady on his feet, and began to walk. The city unfolded around him like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Skyscrapers loomed, their windows reflecting the dull sky. People hurried past, their faces blurred and distant. He felt like a ghost, unseen and unheard. Then, a voice broke through the haze. "Hey, you okay?" Baron turned to see an older man with a kind face and a scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. The man held out a blanket and a paper bag. "You look like you could use this." Baron hesitated, then took the offerings. The blanket was thin but warm, and the bag held a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Thank you," he croaked, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. The man nodded. "There's a shelter a few blocks that way if you need a place to stay." He pointed down the street before walking away, leaving Baron standing there, clutching the blanket and the sandwich like they were lifelines. For the first time since he woke up, he felt a flicker of hope. The soup kitchen was a small, unassuming building tucked between a laundromat and a pawnshop. The smell of bread and broth wafted through the air, drawing Baron inside. The room was warm, filled with the hum of conversation and the clatter of dishes. A woman with silver hair and a bright smile greeted him at the door. "Welcome," she said, her voice warm. "I'm Clara. Grab a tray and join the line." Baron obeyed, his hands shaking as he picked up a tray. The line moved slowly, but no one seemed to mind. When he reached the counter, Clara handed him a bowl of soup and a slice of bread. "Find a seat," she said. "And if you need anything, just ask." He sat at a table near the window, his eyes darting around the room. The other patrons were a mix of ages and backgrounds, but they all shared the same weary yet grateful expression. Baron took a sip of the soup, the warmth spreading through him like a balm. Clara sat down across from him, her hands folded on the table. "First time here?" she asked. Baron nodded, his mouth full of bread. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," she said gently. "But if you do, I'm here to listen." He hesitated, then set down his spoon. I don't know who I am," he admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Clara's expression softened. "Amnesia? I think so," he said. "I woke up in the park this morning. No wallet, no ID. Just nothing." She reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "You're not alone," she said. "We'll help you figure this out. One step at a time." For the first time in what felt like forever, Baron felt like he could breathe. The dumpster behind the grocery store smelled of rotting food and stale cardboard. Baron wrinkled his nose as he sifted through the trash, looking for anything edible. His stomach growled, a constant reminder of his hunger. Then, something caught his eye, a torn photograph, half buried under a pile of discarded newspapers. He picked it up, brushing off the dirt. The image was faded, but he could make out a woman and a child, their faces glowing with laughter. Something about the photo felt familiar. He stared at it, his heart pounding. The woman's smile, the child's bright eyes, they tugged at something deep inside him. A memory flickered, just out of reach. He saw a kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows. The woman was there, humming as she stirred a pot on the stove. The child ran into the room, holding a toy, and the woman laughed. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving Baron clutching the photo, his breath coming in short gasps. Who were they? And why did the memory fill him with both warmth and dread? He tucked the photo into his pocket and walked away, his mind racing. For the first time, he had a clue, a fragile thread connecting him to his past. And he was determined to follow it, no matter where it led. The shelter was a modest brick building with a flickering neon sign that read Hope Haven. Baron hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. The weight of the day pressed down on him, but the promise of a warm bed and a safe place to sleep pulled him forward. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of bleach and old carpet. A man with a clipboard stood behind a counter, his eyes scanning the room with practiced efficiency. He looked up as Baron approached. "Name?" the man asked, his tone brisk but not unkind. "Baron," he said, the name slipping out before he could think. It felt right, though he couldn't say why. The man nodded and scribbled something on his clipboard. "Welcome, Baron. I'm Marcus. Grab a cot in the back and get some rest. Breakfast is at 6. Baron followed the instructions, weaving through rows of cots until he found an empty one near the wall. He sat down, the thin mattress sagging under his weight. Around him, the other residents were settling in for the night, some chatting quietly, others already asleep. Marcus appeared a few minutes later, holding a folded blanket. "Here," he said, handing it to Baron. "You look like you've had a rough day." "Thanks," Baron said, his voice quiet. Marcus lingered, his sharp eyes studying Baron. "You new to the streets?" I don't know," Baron admitted. "I can't remember much." Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "Well, if you need anything, let me know. We're all in this together." As Marcus walked away, Baron lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling. The shelter was noisy, but the hum of voices and the occasional snore felt oddly comforting. For the first time in days, he didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning, Baron wandered the streets, the torn photograph burning a hole in his pocket. He had no plan, no destination, just a desperate need to piece together the fragments of his life. As he turned a corner, a man stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path. He was tall, with a scar running down his cheek and a coldness in his eyes that made Baron's stomach twist. "You've been asking questions," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. Baron took a step back, his heart racing. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man leaned in, his breath hot on Baron's face. "Stop digging into things that don't concern you. Some memories are better left buried." Before Baron could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving him standing there, his hands trembling. The encounter left him shaken but more determined than ever. Whoever this man was, he knew something about Baron's past, something dark and dangerous. And Baron wasn't going to stop until he found out what it was. The public library was a sanctuary of quiet and order. Baron hesitated at the entrance, feeling out of place in his worn clothes, but the librarian at the front desk gave him a kind smile and a nod. He made his way to the computer terminals, his hands fumbling as he typed in the few details he could remember. The name Baron yielded nothing useful, but when he searched for missing persons cases in New York, one article caught his eye. "Local man disappears amidst allegations of fraud." The headline sent a chill down his spine. He clicked on the article, his eyes scanning the text. The details were vague, but the name, Baron Ellis, stood out like a beacon. The article mentioned a wife and child, a small business, and a sudden disappearance after accusations of embezzlement. There was no photo, but the description matched the fragments of memory Baron had been piecing together. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Was this him? Was he Baron Ellis, a man accused of crimes he couldn't remember committing? The thought filled him with a mix of dread and determination. He needed to know more, about the accusations, about his family, about the life he had left behind. As he left the library, the torn photograph felt heavier in his pocket. The woman and the child in the photo, were they his wife and daughter? And if so, where were they now? The answers were out there, waiting for him. And he was ready to find them, no matter the cost. The alley was narrow and dark, the kind of place where shadows seemed to move on their own. Baron's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he ran, his feet slapping against the wet pavement. Behind him, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed, growing louder with every second. "Stop!" a voice shouted, harsh and commanding. Baron didn't look back. He couldn't. His heart pounded in his chest as he rounded a corner, only to find himself facing a dead end. A chain-link fence loomed in front of him, too high to climb. He turned, his back pressed against the fence, as two men emerged from the shadows. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by hoods. One of them held a gun, its barrel glinting in the dim light. "You shouldn't have run," the man with the gun said, his voice cold. Baron's mind raced, but there was no way out. He raised his hands, his voice trembling. "Please! I don't know what you want." The man stepped closer, the gun inches from Baron's face. "You know too much. And now you're a liability." The sound of a siren cut through the air, distant but growing louder. The men exchanged a glance, then the one with the gun lowered it. "This isn't over," he hissed before they both turned and disappeared into the night. Baron slid to the ground, his legs giving out beneath him. The memory, or was it a flashback, faded as quickly as it had come, leaving him shaking and drenched in sweat. He was sitting on a park bench, the sun shining down on him. The library was across the street, its doors still open. The memory felt so real, so vivid, but it couldn't have been. Could it? He clutched the torn photograph in his hand, the faces of the woman and child staring back at him. Whoever they were connected to this. And he was running out of time to find out how. The address on the back of the photograph led Baron to a small apartment building in Queens. He stood outside, his heart pounding as he stared at the door. The woman in the photo, his sister, if the memory was correct, was inside. He knocked, the sound echoing in the quiet hallway. A moment later, the door opened, revealing a woman with tired eyes and a wary expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. Baron held up the photograph, his hand trembling. I think you know me." The woman's eyes widened as she took in his face. "Baron?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Is that really you?" He nodded, his throat tight. "I don't remember much, but I think you're my sister." She stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. "Where have you been? We thought you were dead." Baron followed her inside, the apartment small but cozy. Photos lined the walls, family portraits, birthday parties, holidays. In every one, he was there, smiling and whole. "I don't remember any of this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. His sister, her name was Lydia, sat him down on the couch. "You disappeared 2 years ago," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "There were accusations, fraud, embezzlement. You said you were innocent, but then you vanished. We thought you'd run." Baron's head spun. "I don't remember any of that," he said. "But I think someone's after me. I think I was set up." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "I always believed you," she said. "But the police, they said the evidence was overwhelming." Baron clenched his fists, a surge of anger and frustration rising in his chest. "I need to clear my name," he said. "For you, for my family. But I don't know where to start." Lydia reached out and took his hand. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Together." The knock on the door came late that night, sharp and insistent. Baron froze, his heart pounding. Lydia looked at him, her face pale. "Don't answer it," he whispered. But it was too late. The door burst open, and 2 men stormed in, their faces masked. Baron recognized them instantly. They were the same men from his flashback. "You just can't stay away, can you?" one of them growled, advancing toward Baron. Lydia screamed, but the other man grabbed her, holding her back. Baron lunged forward, tackling the first man to the ground. They struggled, fists flying, until Baron managed to break free. "Run!" he shouted to Lydia, but she was already on the phone, calling for help. The men hesitated, glancing at each other. This isn't over. One of them spat before they turned and fled, disappearing into the night. Baron collapsed onto the floor, his body aching but his mind clearer than ever. He knew what he had to do. The police station was brightly lit, its sterile walls a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few days. Baron sat in a small room, his hands clasped in front of him. Across the table, a detective listened intently as Baron recounted everything he could remember, the flashbacks, the photograph, the men who had been chasing him. "We'll look into it," the detective said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "But you understand that turning yourself in means you'll have to face the charges." Baron nodded. "I know," he said. "But I'd rather face the truth than keep running." Outside, Lydia waited for him, her face filled with a mix of relief and worry. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "I'm sure," Baron said. "I need to make things right. For you, for my family, for me." As he was led away, he felt a strange sense of peace. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward. The story ends with Baron sitting in a jail cell, the torn photograph in his hand. The faces of the woman and child smiled up at him, a reminder of what he was fighting for. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was Baron Ellis, and he was ready to reclaim his life.